Welcome back to the Tuesdays with Merton webinar. I'm Liz Burkemper, and I serve on the board of directors of the International Thomas Merton Society. Tuesdays with Merton is presented by the International Thomas Merton Society, or ITMS, and co-sponsored by the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Join us for this webinar series on the second Tuesday of each month. Tonight's webinar will be recorded as well as available both on YouTube and as a podcast soon after the live event. The talk will be followed by moderated discussion and Q&A, so hold on to your questions and we'll be excited to chat after. The ITMS has local chapters across the globe meeting to study Merton's writings and build communities around his interests in spirituality, peacemaking, and interreligious dialogue. You can find out if there's an ITMS chapter near you or how to start one at merton.org/ITMS/chapters. This evening, we have with us the director of the Chicago chapter, Mike Brennan, to share a few words about what goes on at the Chicago chapter. Mike?
Well, thank you, Liz. I would like to mention that one of the fruits of the recent ITMS conference in Denver is the formation of a chapter coordinator committee, which includes Mike Smulka of Connecticut, Roger Butts of Denver, and myself. And together we hope to improve communication among our chapter leaders, share our vision for a more connected, energetic society, and to build ITMS membership. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to say a little bit about our Chicago chapter. You can learn more about our current and past meetings at ccitms.blogspot.com, which I have put in the chat. The chapter was founded in 1992, so we're one of the older continuously operating ITMS chapters in the US. Since our founding, our Chicago chapter has offered hundreds of presentations, including lectures, films, workshops, as well as theatrical and musical events. In harmony with the vision of Thomas Merton, the purpose of the chapter is to aid in the development of a mature adult spirituality. We promote the goals of the ITMS, particularly assisting members in exploring the unique spiritual journey of Thomas Merton through shared insights. Talks have been devoted to prayer and contemplation, the monastic life, interfaith dialogue, and peace and justice issues, among other things. We meet from 2 to 4 p.m. on the third Sunday of the month, except during the summertime, at Euclid United Methodist Church, 405 South Euclid Avenue in Oak Park, Illinois. All are welcome. There is no admission, but we gratefully accept free will offerings to cover expenses such as speaker honorariums and refreshments. We are grateful to Pastor Nancy Blade and the Euclid United Methodist community for welcoming us, and to Tony Asta for facilitating our meetings, and to Nancy Kramer, who is our hospitality chairperson. Our next meeting on Sunday, September the 21st, will feature iconographer and author Joseph Melham, discussing Catholic heroes of the 20th century, new icons for a new millennium. Joe's artwork has appeared on the cover of the Merton Seasonal, and he currently has an exhibit at Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston. On October 19th, Judith Valente, the immediate past president of ITMS and a member of our chapter, will discuss her new book, The Italian Soul. On November 16th, another chapter member, Vinnie Donnelly, will discuss Merton in Rome, based on Merton's writings and Vinnie's own exploration of the places that Merton visited in Rome. Through the years, our chapter has been extremely fortunate to host a number of outstanding speakers, including Merton biographer and peace activist Jim Forrest, and numerous Merton scholars and authors, including Father Vaughn Fail, Sister Suzanne Zurcher, Sister Monica Weiss, Paul Pearson, Pauline Viviano, Pat O'Connell, Dan Horan, John Sweeney, Gordon Oyer, and many others. We were privileged to host Father Dan Coughlin, who served as the 59th chaplain of the United States House of Representatives from 2000 to 2011, the first Catholic to do so. We've welcomed people who knew Merton, such as Brother Paul Quenin, Tommy O'Callahan, and Dick Sisto, and we sponsored the 12th General Meeting of the ITMS in 2011 at Loyola University, Chicago. So I want to thank you again for listening, and if you have any questions about forming or joining an ITMS chapter, my email is in the chat, cc.itms@gmail.com, and you can also find it listed under Chapters and Affiliates page on the ITMS website, merton.org. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks so much, Mike. Now I'd like to invite Paul Pinkoski, the current president of the ITMS, to offer our opening prayer. Paul?
Good evening, everybody. I thought that rather than a formal prayer, we might draw on some of Merton's words, calling us to attention and engagement to frame our listening for this evening's talk. Join me, please, first in taking a couple of deep, slow breaths before we begin. When I pray for peace, I pray that not only will the enemies of my country cease to want war, but above all, my own country will cease to do the things that make war inevitable. Pray for peace, because people need it, and because violence will lead inevitably to the establishment of tyranny in one form or another. Pray for freedom, both for those who know they are not free, and especially for those who think they are free and do not realize they are prisoners of dead ideas and prejudices. The real root of Christian hope is the presence of the risen Lord among us and in us by his Spirit, which is the spirit and power of love. The power of the resurrection is the power of love, which is stronger than death and evil, and its promise is the promise that the power of this love is ours, if we freely accept it. To accept it is not just a matter of making a wish, but of entire and total commitment to the law of Christ, which is the law of love. Let us realize this and believe it and pray for one another. Amen.
Thank you so much, Paul, for setting us up for the evening. Now it is my honor to introduce our speaker for the evening, Ryan Bell. Ryan is a recent graduate of the University of Denver and a professed Benedictine Oblate at Benet Hill Monastery in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Ryan was also a Daggy Scholar at the 2023 ITMS meeting at St. Mary's College. Here is Ryan Bell on Pilgrims in a Polarized Church, Thomas Merton and Raymond Hunthausen. Ryan?
Thank you so much, Liz, and Paul, for that beautiful prayer, offering me some deep breaths when I certainly needed it. And also to Mike, I've never wanted to move to Chicago more after hearing the wonderful stuff that the ITMS chapter is doing there. So many thanks to all of you. All right. You should be able to see my screen at this point. And before I begin, I just want to say, following on what others have said, how important and what a balm this Tuesdays with Merton series is for me, a balm on a weary soul in our world today, and how much I appreciate the International Thomas Merton Society and the spaces of community that we're able to offer through events like this. I've benefited so much from what's been provided spiritually, intellectually, interpersonally, and also by sharing stories, because so much of our gatherings are about sharing stories. And so that's how I would like to start tonight, is by sharing a story. On August 6th, 1945, at St. Edward's Seminary in Kenmore, Washington, the bells were tolling. The seminary's students had just received word that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and that the United States had taken a major step towards victory in its war against Japan. The mood was celebratory. It was a glorious late summer day, and the students, donning long black cassocks, assembled in the chapel to sing the Te Deum, a traditional Catholic hymn of praise. Attendance at the service was strictly mandatory, but one seminarian was conspicuously absent. When this lone seminarian heard the news that the bomb had been dropped, he escaped into the woods and wept. His name was Raymond Hunthausen. This would be the first and perhaps the most important moment in Hunthausen's journey towards full and total resistance against not just the use of nuclear weapons, but their very existence. Hunthausen would rise through the ranks of the Catholic hierarchy, and he would eventually become the Archbishop of Seattle. But he could never let go of the experience of August 6th, 1945. As his biographer John McCoy put it, he saw bodies burnt, mangled, and irradiated, lying in a spectral landscape of blackened rivers and the charred skeletal remains of demolished buildings. These scenes sank into his soul and festered there, nagging at his conscience. But Hunthausen's experience that day only partially accounted for his strong, controversial anti-war stance as an archbishop many years later. If Hiroshima made Hunthausen viscerally aware of the horrors of nuclear weapons, then the writings of Thomas Merton helped give him the voice and the courage to speak out against them. Hunthausen's writings and speeches during his tenure as Archbishop of Seattle show that Merton had a clear pattern of influence over his thinking, and that the Archbishop's advocacy for peace, for which he paid dearly, was directly inspired by the monk from Gethsemane, whom he would never meet. I want to stress at this point that Hunthausen was not a theologian. He never wrote a book during his tenure as Archbishop. His pastoral writings as Archbishop and as bishop often drew on his own experience of the divine, through other people, through his prayer practice, through spending time in nature. He also was very candid about his own shortcomings in life and in his ministry and in his role. So many of the parallels between Merton and Hunthausen, they become more clear through stories, actions, lived experience, because like I said, the two never met. In fact, they never even exchanged correspondence. Instead, Hunthausen was part of the majority of us who never had met have never met Merton in person, but who were nevertheless deeply changed by his writings. So, for context, who exactly was Raymond Hunthausen? I find that many people of a certain age, especially progressive Catholics of a certain age, know who I'm talking about when I mention Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen. But it's important to provide some background, since one of the beautiful things that I love about the ITMS and about Tuesdays with Merton is that we draw from such a rich variety of ages and of faith traditions. Plus, it's no use demonstrating how Merton inspired Archbishop Hunthausen if you don't even know who he is in the first place. So, some background. Hunthausen's life began far away from any physical center of ecclesiastical or even political importance. He was born in Anaconda, Montana, a small workers' town to a large and deeply Catholic family. He was a typical Anaconda youth, working at his father's grocery store in the late 1920s after attending Catholic schools staffed by nuns. His call to the priesthood came through an inspiring priest at Carroll College in Helena, Montana, where he was earning a degree in chemistry. He soon decided to join the seminary at St. Edward in Washington State. After his ordination, his ecclesiastical star rose quite quickly. In 1953, he was appointed as a chemistry professor at Carroll College before ascending to the presidency of his alma mater 4 years later. Father Hunthausen, or at that time President Hunthausen, was energetic, he was industrious. He earned a reputation as a visionary leader at the college, starting a building spree and increasing enrollment. But his administrative farsightedness did not mean that he was a progressive. Father Hunthausen was a stickler, disciplining students if they missed the mandatory daily mass at 6 in the morning, and expelling students immediately if they were caught spending a night in a dorm with a member of the opposite sex. His outlook was consistent with that of the church at the time, hierarchical, strict, uncompromising. But his leadership at Carroll College caught Rome's attention, and in July of 1962, he was appointed Bishop of Helena. However, as many of us know, 1962 was quite a watershed moment in the history of the Catholic Church. After having been a bishop for only several weeks, Hunthausen arrived at St. Peter's Basilica for the opening of the Second Vatican Council. More than any other event in his life, Vatican II revolutionized Hunthausen's understanding of faith, conscience, and the role of the Church in the modern world. For 4 years, Hunthausen absorbed and contributed to the council. as the church moved from definition to mystery, from threats to persuasion, from coercion to conscience, and from ruling to serving, as the historian Father John O'Malley famously described the council. When he returned to Helena, Hunthausen made it his first priority to introduce Vatican II's reforms to the diocese. This once again gained him the attention of the Vatican, and in 1975, Pope Paul VI appointed him as Archbishop of Seattle. Seattle was a world away from the ecclesiastical backwater of Helena, and Hunthausen was quite unprepared for the prominence and the power held by somebody in a metropolitan archbishopric like Seattle. Now, what you're seeing in front of you, I included these very specific images because they show very physically the effect that Vatican II had on Hunthausen. So the photo on the left is from his installation as Bishop of Helena. So his bishop's staff, or as it's called, the crozier, is metal, ornate. He's wearing episcopal gloves that were then phased out after Vatican II. His vestments are trimmed with lace. However, on the right is a picture from his installation as Archbishop of Seattle. Notice that he shed and toned down the trappings of his office. He kept that same wooden crozier that he's holding in that picture during the entirety of his time as Archbishop. He was never gifted another one. He refused gifts like that. In fact, he was often confused to be a simple priest because he didn't wear any clerical garb other than a Roman collar. Other times, he didn't wear that at all, and people just thought he was a normal man, not even a priest. He emerged from the council a changed man, and he inherited Seattle's Catholic Church at a very promising time. In the post-war years of the baby boom, Seattle's Catholic population metastasized, and Catholics began to move into the suburbs, similar to patterns across the country, especially on the eastern seaboard. However, the stability that underpinned the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church was melting away. While the faithful were empowered to live their faith like never before, priests and women religious, who had been the traditional symbols of church life, were exiting their vocations in droves. In short, Hunthausen came to a post-conciliar Seattle church that was hopeful, yet haphazard. Many have called Seattle in the years after Vatican II a testing ground or a laboratory for the more radical ideas of Vatican II, the more progressive and spirit of the council ideas of Vatican II. Others have called it a very adult church, a mature church at that time. Hunthausen came to this church, and he began to come in contact with peace advocates very soon after he got there, both Catholic and non-Catholic, who were very dedicated to the cause of opposing the buildup of nuclear arms. One such advocate that he met very early on was a man named James Douglas. James Douglas was a Catholic theologian, an author, and a devotee of Thomas Merton. In his correspondence with Hunthausen, he shared quotes from Merton and other earlier advocates for peace, like Dorothy Day. And Douglas's correspondence with Hunthausen really piqued the Archbishop's interest in the monk from Kentucky, whom he had never met and who had died years earlier. This was his first introduction to Merton. The Archbishop's opposition to nuclear arms could not have come at a tenser time. By the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan's administration quickly sought to toughen the United States' posture of countering the Soviet Union, which Reagan famously dubbed the evil empire. In order to put some muscle behind his new stance, Reagan rejuvenated a policy of nuclear deterrence by approving new programs to develop nuclear weapons and fortifying the nation's existing nuclear arsenal. Military bases around the country played host to these defter and deadlier weapons of total war. One such location was Bangor Naval Base, about 20 miles west of Seattle's Cathedral via a ferry ride. Even among military installations, Bangor stood out because it was home to the embodiment of the Reagan administration's deterrence policy, the Trident submarines. From end to end, these subs were taller than a Space Needle and carried 192 warheads, each with 6 times the explosive power as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The United States military was a significant contributor to Seattle's economy, giving it political weight and a certain sense of immunity from criticism among local leaders. Soon, Hunthausen would come to experience the wrath that such criticism incurred. The proximity of the Trident submarines to Seattle bothered Hunthausen. After all, he was the shepherd of this local flock. But Hunthausen was by no means a rabble-rouser, nor did he like to attract controversy. He was the definition of low profile. So it came as a shock to even his closest friends what he did next. On the evening of June 12, 1981, against the counsel of his advisors, Archbishop Hunthausen stepped onto the podium at Pacific Lutheran University and informed his audience that after much prayer, he had decided to withhold 1/2 of his federal income taxes to protest the Reagan administration's nuclear arms buildup, and he encouraged others to do the same. This was a risky move. Not only would the IRS garnish wages, but he also put himself in the path for imprisonment if he continued to do this over a long period of time. He encouraged others to do the same, and this was a risky move. He fully faced the grim reality of nuclear war. And Hunthausen told his audience that night that as Jesus rejected violence, so must they. The teaching of Jesus, he said, tells us to render to a nuclear-armed Caesar what the Caesar deserves: tax resistance. Before this, nobody had any inkling that the quiet, deferential archbishop would eventually find himself one of the most controversial Roman Catholic leaders in the country, or that his unqualified opposition to the nuclear arms race and his consequent act of civil disobedience, i.e. the tax protest, would unsettle the public conscience, as an article from the Seattle Weekly put it at the time. Before long, his tax protest would not just unsettle the public conscience, but ruffle the Vatican's feathers. But that was to come. So at this point, you may be wondering, where did Hunthausen's fervent anti-nuclear advocacy come from? As mentioned earlier, the Archbishop was neither a maverick, nor was he an attention getter. So far, I've been describing Hunthausen as a typical Vatican II bishop. But not all church leaders in this time spoke out so incredibly forcefully against nuclear weapons, nor did they put their own livelihoods on the line in the way he did. So why did Hunthausen speak out more forcefully than any archbishop since the first atomic bomb exploded? Now, his visceral experience in seminary after the bombing of Hiroshima certainly comes to mind. But Hunthausen's fervent and sustained advocacy for peace also had its roots in the writings and thought of Thomas Merton. Merton's writings insisting on the impermissibility of nuclear war were given life through Hunthausen's ministry, to the point that Merton's rhetorical voice and style regularly mixed into Hunthausen's speeches and writings on this topic. Merton was, in a sense, a muse of Hunthausen's, providing a contemplative template that spurred the archbishop to action. At the baseline level, neither Merton nor Hunthausen consistently felt that they were the most well-placed advocates for peace. In a letter to the Jesuit Father John Ford in 1962, Merton wrote, "I suffer from my limitations, and I wish I were more of a professional, because an increased sophistication and a deeper experience of the problems and methods would help me serve the truth much better." Similarly, when Hunthausen received awards for his work advocating against Reagan's nuclear buildup, he often approached his acceptance remarks somewhat bashfully. In one instance, he wrote, "I consider myself to be a committed but very inadequate spokesman for countless people around our world who have become convinced not only of the utter futility of the present arms race, but also of its inherent immorality. It is really in their name, more than in my own, that I accept this award." Both Merton and Hunthausen were quick to laud others for their peace work and downplay the importance of their own. Both men also saw the global tilt towards nuclear war during that time as a product of individual instability and internal violence. Merton famously declared that the root of all war is fear in his 1961 book, New Seeds of Contemplation. To him, what was most dangerous was, quote, "our hatred of ourselves, particularly that hatred of ourselves which is too deep and too powerful to be consciously faced. For it is this which makes us see our own evil in others and unable to see it in ourselves." Hunthausen made a similar point about the complicity of one's own inner roots many years later. It was 1991, and the Archbishop had been invited to deliver a speech at a rally in downtown Seattle, protesting the first Gulf War. The speakers preceding him thundered on with gusto, denouncing the American government in strict terms and endorsing mass demonstrations around the country against the war. Hunthausen struck a different tone. He stepped up to the microphone, introduced himself merely as Ray Hunthausen, and said, quote, "We need to admit that in each of us there is some violence. We need to make sure that we do not become part of what we are here to protest." After his remarks, the crowd, which earlier in the day had threatened to storm Seattle's federal building, drifted off quietly into the night. Similarly, in an address to Pax Christi USA's National Assembly 4 years earlier, Hunthausen said, "Nuclear war begins, I believe, in our hearts, and that is where it must end. For that reason, deterrence is not extrinsic to the evil of nuclear war. From that moral perspective, deterrence finds itself at the center of the evil. In other words, our intention or willingness to do the sin could become the sin. The reconciling way of the cross is, I believe, the way of our nonviolent, reconciling God. I believe the way of the cross is the way to peace on earth. In this address, Hunthausen took Merton's "the root of war is fear" and gave it an inverse response, but just as true. The root of peace is the way of the cross. In fact, Jesus' suffering and death on the cross was a central theme of the Christian movement against nuclear arms. In a letter to Etta Gulick in 1961, Merton wrote that he viewed violence and war as, quote, purely and simply the crucifixion all over again. Those who think there can be a just cause for measures that gravely risk leading to the destruction of the entire human race are in the most dangerous illusion. And if they are Christian, they are purely and simply arming themselves with hammer and nails, without realizing it, to crucify and deny Christ. The crucifixion is one of the most striking through lines between the monk and the archbishop. During Hunthausen's famous tax resistance speech in 1981, he outlined the toll that nuclear weapons proliferation should take on a Christian, saying, "I say with deep sorrow that our nuclear war preparations are the global crucifixion of Jesus. What we do to the least of these through our nuclear war planning, we do to Jesus. That is his teaching. We cannot avoid it, and we should not try. Our nuclear weapons are the final crucifixion of Jesus in the extermination of the human family with whom he is one." There was no escaping the severity of Hunthausen's crucifixion metaphor, and he uses phrases similarly potent to those that Merton had employed years earlier. However, both men had an understanding of what nonviolence required that went beyond metaphors. Merton understood that his lifestyle, his very lifestyle, had to be an act of protest in order to fully renounce violence. His Trappist monastic vows were more than promises. They were acts of resistance against the forces in the social milieu that encouraged violence. In his preface to the Japanese edition of The Seven-Story Mountain, Merton wrote, "It is my intention to make my entire life a rejection of, a protest against the crimes and injustices of war and political tyranny which threaten to destroy the whole human race and the whole world. By my monastic life and vows, I am saying no to the violence and the nuclear weapons. If I say no to all these forces, I also say yes to all that is good in the world and in humanity." Like monastic life, the call to nonviolence was not for the faint of heart. In 1981, Archbishop Hunthausen alluded that he was aware that his nonviolent tax resistance would also have far-reaching consequences, consequences even more potent than the local backlash he was receiving from military communities in the Seattle Archdiocese. During a speech at a peace rally in October of that year, he said, quote, "Nonviolence requires at least as much of our lives as war does. What further steps that will mean in my life, I hope to leave at God's will, as that will is revealed in response to prayer. Whatever it is, I am certain it will be harder than anything I have in mind today. I think one consequence of praying our way into nonviolence is that God takes us more seriously than we wish. A prayerful nonviolence is dangerous to our lives." And as it happened, prayerful nonviolence did become dangerous to both men's lives. Merton's writings on peace began to be more closely inspected by his Trappist order, and by April of 1962, Merton was forbidden by his superiors to publish on the subject of war. As is well known, Merton's most revolutionary writings on war, peace, and nonviolence came from unpublished letters and book manuscripts that collected dust for years, being published only after his death. Merton was silenced, and in this regard, he and Hunthausen are a study in contrasts. In 1983, 2 years after he announced his tax protest against the Reagan administration's nuclear rearmament, Hunthausen received a phone call from Pope John Paul II's delegate to the United States, Archbishop Pio Laghi. Laghi informed Hunthausen that he and the entire Archdiocese of Seattle would be undergoing an apostolic visitation conducted by the Vatican. While the word visitation might conjure up images of Mary and Elizabeth from the Gospels, this visitation would be anything but full of grace. Apostolic visitations only occur in the most exceptional of circumstances and are somewhat equivalent to a Vatican investigation on rule breaking. Archbishop Laghi revealed that he had received instructions that the Holy Father himself was initiating the apostolic visitation in Seattle because of serious reservations of a pastoral and doctrinal nature regarding the Archdiocese and Hunthausen personally. Over the course of the next 5 years, Hunthausen was publicly questioned by his own church, his authority as archbishop being undermined in the process. The Vatican alleged he had been too welcoming of gay people, too generous with annulments, too friendly to Protestants, even giving them communion, and too soft on women who wished to be ordained as priests. Pope John Paul appointed an auxiliary bishop with special faculties to govern over this Vatican self-styled problem areas, humiliating Hunthausen and calling into question his leadership in the most public of methods. Hunthausen stood firm, constantly asserting that his pastoral practices were no different than any other average American bishops. While Merton was silenced, Hunthausen was made into an example. The reason that the Vatican chose to investigate Hunthausen for his pastoral leadership, while other bishops were able to govern unimpeded, remains in question. One theory, however, is that his work for nuclear disarmament may have led to closer Vatican scrutiny. At the time of the visitation, the Holy See was in the process of gaining full diplomatic ties with the United States, a delicate moment for relations between the two countries. Additionally, Pope John Paul II admired President Reagan's staunch anti-communism, and he saw a warm relationship with the White House as essential to liberating his homeland of Poland. In this environment, just one American bishop loudly, publicly protesting the Reagan administration's nuclear policies could undo years of Vatican diplomatic success in gaining formal diplomatic relations. To this day, many of the Archbishop's supporters see a through line between Hunthausen's tax protest against the Reagan administration and the subsequent Vatican investigation of his ministry. After the visitation, Hunthausen only briefly regained full control over the affairs of the Archdiocese of Seattle. He resigned in 1992, 5 years before the mandatory retirement age of 75, citing exhaustion. In his last homily at Seattle's St. James Cathedral before his resignation took effect, Archbishop Hunthausen noted that Thomas Merton had been a tremendous companion during his tenure in Seattle, especially during the difficult years of the visitation. 30 years earlier, Merton had expressed his disappointment at the insignificance of the peace movement within his own church, writing, "The Catholics in the peace movement we are now starting are not the most influential in the country by any means. Quite the contrary. There are just a few priests, no bishops." But at this time, the seeds of the peace movement were just being sown. Decades later, the Catholic peace movement became all-encompassing: laity, priests, women religious, bishops, and yes, even an archbishop. Far west from the hill country of Kentucky, after Merton's death, Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen heard the monks' words and acted on them. Today, people of faith in Seattle continue to protest nuclear arms proliferation in their own communities. As is common, their activism is grassroots. The Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, which was founded by Hunthausen's old friend Jim Douglas, who introduced him to Merton, this center continues to host meetings, organize protests, and plan public displays, much like the highway billboard shown here. In recent years, the current Archbishop of Seattle, Paul Aitchen, has traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to meet with the bishops of these dioceses and issued joint statements calling on nations to never again use nuclear arms. But the advocacy in Seattle is sadly not reflected in major institutions like the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and certainly not in the policy of the federal government. Hunthausen's Seattle is a point of hope, no matter how small, and no matter how in the ever more distant past. All of which begs the question, what if the majority of ecclesiastical leaders, Catholic,
Thank you so much, Ryan, for everything that you've shared with us this evening. This has been totally fascinating. I hadn't heard of Archbishop Hunthausen before, so thank you. With that, I would like to turn it over to Paul Pinkoski, our moderator for the evening, to lead us in discussion and question and answer.
Thanks, Liz. And Ryan, thank you so much for that for the great background and the coming to grips with the dynamic between Merton and Hunthausen and Hunthausen's witness in Seattle. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Or you can go to the reactions button and raise your hand. If we see the yellow hand waving, then I can go to you for a question. While you're pondering what you might want to ask Ryan, let me start with asking Ryan, what do you see perhaps as the cost to the church of silencing prophetic voices like Merton's and Hunthausen?
I see two costs, and one of them is a little bit more surface level, and one is goes more to the heart of what the church should be and is. Um, the surface level cost is reputation. When the church sacrifices people on kind of the altar of normality or conforming, especially to conforming to societal or governmental obligations, such as we saw in the 1980s with Reagan and John Paul II, it loses a lot of credibility. Prophets have always not been very welcomed, and I understand that there's a role for prophets to always be outside of the margins, even within the church. However, I believe that the church does a disservice to its people, to the people that are to the faithful in the church by silencing prophets, and by especially by making examples of prophets. One of the things, the Catholic Church, the word Catholic means universal. One of the strengths of the Catholic Church over the ages, what has been when it has been inclusive, when it has allowed for broader theological viewpoints, opinions to be included within the big tent. And it narrows, and it often gets much smaller when it gets more conservative and ideologically blinded. And so that's issue number one. But issue number two, I would say, is fidelity to the gospel. Because when you sacrifice prophets, you are in your own way sacrificing Jesus, I think. And you were sacrificing the message that was handed down in the Gospels, because Jesus flipped tables. Jesus was a rebel. Jesus did not sit very nicely and have a nice bilateral meeting with Caesar. He was a change agent. He moved against that. And so I think those are the two things that the church loses, is reputation, but I also have to say that the church moves away from the Gospels whenever it does that.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from Liz, not Liz Burkemper, but Liz Coombs. In your opinion, which of Merton's books published after his death are most important for readers?
Cold War
I'm
letters.
assuming from what Liz's question that this has to do with the peacemaking, Liz?
Guessing so. Silence is a yes, right? I would say Cold War letters, mainly because it's a collection of his private thoughts, and also you're seeing very situational awareness. He's reacting to current events. He's discussing what happened that day or that week in his letters. And I mean, most of the sources that I took for this presentation that were attributed to Thomas Merton, many of them, I would say the majority of them, were taken from the Cold War letters, because they're such, I'd say, unvarnished, honest thoughts. Two friends, two people he respected, well, maybe not colleagues is the right word, but monastic colleagues and people within the church, about how he felt as the United States was really careening towards. Also, the period of time that the Cold War letters were written, right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, meant that this wasn't détente. This wasn't Nixon. This was when there was a real sense in the American social mind, and even permeating the walls of the monastery, that we could get blown to smithereens at any second. And so the immediacy of the Cold War letters, I think, is what makes them so powerful. So if I had to recommend one, that would be it.
Ryan, also, I was thinking as you were talking that when Merton was silenced, I would see his reaction as being subversive, because he gathered those letters, mimeographed them, and mailed them to all sorts of people
True.
who copied them and mailed them again. And then in 1964, he held a peace retreat with a group of activists, most of whom ended up in jail afterwards. Um, did Hunthausen, when the Vatican was stepping on him, did he find ways of working below the radar?
He did. And that's a good point that you bring up. I hope in my talk that I didn't slightly mistreat the subversion that Merton did accomplish with the way he distributed his letters, mimeographed them, held peace retreats. He was silenced, but he was not silent, I would say. However, that is to say that for Hunthausen, he was always very respectful of Vatican authority, and he would always profess allegiance to Pope John Paul II, his doctrinal watchdog, Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, who became Benedict XVI. He was always very clear about that. However, he would never ever let an accusation go unanswered. The Vatican at one point created a list of various infractions that they saw occurring in the Archdiocese of Seattle, where they were too lax on those points that I listed in the talk, such as intercommunion with Protestants and not clamping down on abortion or women who wanted to be priests. And and then the Vatican released that list to the New York Times, and they published it in Section A. And of course, that was a bit of a provocation to release it to a major news outlet, which the Vatican normally would not do. However, Hunthausen, through his assistants, wrote a point by point by point rebuttal. Every single specific thing that the Vatican accused him of, he said, no, and here are examples. No, and here are examples. And he would publish those. And while also staying true to his allegiance to the Pope, he never ever bowed and said, no, never mind, I'm sorry, I messed up. He said, my pastoral fidelity, or my pastoral practices were called into question, never my doctrinal fidelity. And he was very clear on that. So that was his resistance, I would say, was that he never bowed completely. He never said that he had any doctrinal problems. And he would point by point always push back respectfully, but he would always push back.
We've got three really good questions here. Well, two that I know of because they're printed, and one that I think is going to be a good one. First and Mark, I see your hand up there, so I won't miss you. Ben Burkemper asking, could you comment on the fidelity of the so-called just war doctrine and the church's reliance or non-reliance on it?
That's an excellent question. And it's very interesting because I was kind of thinking that somebody might ask this question or somewhere close to it. And so I was reflecting the last couple of days about just war and the American Catholic response to just war. If you look at the Challenge of Peace, which was in the 1980s, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops came out with a teaching document about the permissibility of nuclear weapons. This was during the Reagan administration, and it was seen as a rebuke of the Reagan administration, but it was nowhere near what Hunthausen was doing. It allowed for certainly the concept of just war. It even allowed for slight deterrence. And so that was the position of the United States bishops during that time. And this was hard fought. The conference would go back and forth. Drafts would be submitted, resubmitted. It was tense. What you see now, and this comes from the Francis papacy, honestly, is a major shift in the American Catholic understanding from the Episcopal level, from the bishops level of just war. I'm sure many of you remember when Pope Francis, he didn't formally repudiate the doctrine of just war. He did not put out a papal bull or anything like that saying that it was no longer Catholic teaching. But he said in many of his comments, there is no such thing as a just war. Yes, we have this doctrine, but it can never be used because there is no such thing as a just war. Just wars cannot exist. That is antithetical. That is paradoxical. And so since then, it's fascinating. We've been seeing more statements from American bishops saying the same thing. And it's much less of a tense issue than it was in the 1980s during Reagan's rearmament. There's much less debate among the bishops whether or not nuclear war is permissible or not. There's more, actually, one of the very few things that the US bishops have consensus on right now, or leaning towards consensus on, is that nuclear war and nuclear weapons are in fact worse than they previously said in their pastoral letter in the 1980s. So we're seeing a shift. And I would say that was entirely triggered by Pope Francis. Toward the end of his life, Archbishop Hunthausen died in He was 95 years old and he died in 2018. And towards the end of his life, he kept saying to people, Francis is trying to do what I was doing. Like Francis is doing what I tried to do in the archdiocese. And he was very grateful that he could live long enough to see Francis and his papacy and the various changes, honestly, the change in tone that Francis incurred. So as much as I cannot comment on the doctrine of just war as applicable in Catholic moral theology, I can say that there's been a major historical shift in the understanding, just the public understanding among the bishops of how we should approach just war and nuclear deterrence.
Right, thank you. And from Deborah Zadalis, division and polarization seems to be getting worse even in the church. Oftentimes, these seem to be fueled by Catholic media, their slant on issues, as well as some church leaders. What lessons from these two men can help us as we navigate these divisions within the church?
Mm. One of the things that stands out to me about Merton, I'll start with Merton, is he had tension upon tension with his abbot for many, many years, James Fox. And Merton, however, he had fidelity to his vow of obedience. He pushed his superiors. I mean, he hammered them in order to try to get a hermitage. But he never spoke ill to his fellow monks, it didn't seem. He never was, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see him as disrupting within the daily practice of monastic life, within the daily practice of being church in Gethsemane. He never sowed division. He had his issues with his superiors and certainly with his fellow monks, and we see that in his journals, but he never actively sowed or was intending to sow division. He had his frustrations, he let them out, but he was not doing that simply to sow, which I think a lot of Catholic news outlets, frankly, and religious news outlets generally do these days because it generates clicks and it generates content and it generates people viewing. Of course, Merton didn't have those pressures as much, but also the incentives were entirely different. And I would say with Hunthausen, once again, coming back to, he never ever publicly disparaged the Holy Father, even though he had serious issues, even though his advisors had serious issues. Often, Hunthausen's closest advisors would draft messages, quite harsh messages back to the Vatican, and Hunthausen would go through point by point, tone down the language, tone down the language. We are not trying to create division. We are trying to reconcile this. We are trying to get this visitation finished and ended. The other thing that Hunthausen did, well, I'll tell a story. One time, he and his advisors were on a plane. They were going, I think it was himself and his chancellor, and they were on a plane to Chicago where they were going to meet with Cardinal Bernardine to try to resolve the Seattle situation. And they were having animated discussion on the plane, and then everybody got up. And it's kind of in that hustle and bustle when everybody's trying to get off the plane, but nobody can because everybody's getting their bags. And a man turned around and jammed a note into Hunthausen's hand and just said, "Here, take this." And Hunthausen opened it up and it was filled with vitriolic statements attacking the Archbishop's character and certainly his doctrinal views. And the man just walked away into the crowd, didn't want to have a conversation. And Hunthausen turned around and said, "I wish I could have sat down with him. I wish we could have talked. Maybe we could have become friends." That was the kind of gentler soul that Hunthausen was. He was a man of dialogue too. Of course, that's Greg Hillis's excellent book on Merton's Catholicity. But I think it's a phrase that I think also is somewhat applicable to Hunthausen, a man of dialogue. So that's what I would say, two tangible examples of both men toning it down for the sake of the church and for the sake, frankly, of society, for humanity. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. We're going to go to Mark Hallahan. Mark, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Paul.
You can
and
unmute. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And it's good. I'm from Los Angeles and a member of the International Thomas Merton Society. And we had a great time in Denver this past summer. And Ryan, I think I can speak for all of us to thank you for raising up Archbishop Hunthausen. That means so much to me and to a lot of us. I was living at the Catholic Worker in Los Angeles during those days when he was demonized, and it was so sad to see that happen and to see, that power just break him they really tried to break him, and I think he was broken, from that, and that's just so sad, and that and many other things, moved many of us, to other denominations, because we saw sort of that happening more and more, and it was just pitiful. The other great prophet bishop was Thomas Gumbleton too, and he from Detroit, and we had a lot of interaction with him at the Worker, and again, he just wouldn't step down. He just was always there, always present, always on the front lines. And then I think another one is Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr is one of the great prophets of our day, and one of the most beautiful things that I saw last year were the photos of him with Pope Francis. And to me, that was like an amazing vindication of everything that Richard stood for, and everything that Hunthausen and Gumbleton and everybody else stood for. This was beautiful. There's Richard sitting, and they're laughing, and it's just those of us who knew Richard. It was just like, oh my God, what a healing that is. And so I think what you did today too is a real healing moment for me especially, and for many of us. And I appreciate that. And the question I have is, who do you see as stepping into a prophetic role, maybe in the hierarchy in the Roman Church? I know that Robert McElroy was sent to Washington, D.C. specifically, I think, to just be one of the forces there. And I'm an Episcopal priest, and our Bishop Marianne Buddy, is also there. So we have these two really great, powerful bishops who are speaking truth to power, and so he's one. Do you see anybody else that's maybe rising to the forefront?
They're rare. They're few and far between. We have, I will say, some ones that are less prominent. I'm a big fan of Cardinal McElroy. Archbishop Wester, also in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. He was a protege of Archbishop Quinn in San Francisco, who was an advocate along the same lines as Archbishop Hunthausen. I would also say he's not an archbishop. Hopefully one day he will be. John Stowe, and he's a frequent contributor to the National Catholic Reporter, and he's in, I believe, Eastern Kentucky. And he's a Franciscan and does very good work there in a very conservative and I think a very difficult place to do good work. And yet he still makes a lot of headway. And once again, he's a man of dialogue. He reaches out to everybody. He talks to everybody. And I think that's what we need. If we're looking for the next Cardinal Dearden, or the next, kind of progressive scion of the church to take the bishops' conference or any leadership organization that way, I don't believe we'll find that anytime soon. And I think that's okay. What we need to look for are the moderates. We need to look for the people that can steer a very difficult organization, the Catholic Church of all things, towards dialogue, towards reconciliation. I think that, Pope Benedict XVI, he had some excellent, wonderful writings, beautiful writings about God. One of the most horrible things he said was that he wanted the church to be smaller because it would be purer. I think that's the antithesis of what the church needs to move forward. And I think it's also exactly what Hunthausen would have been against. Also, just to comment real quick on your comment about Richard Rohr, I mentioned at the end of my talk that Hunthausen said that Thomas Merton had been a tremendous influence on him during his time in Seattle. The other person he mentioned during his last homily was Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr came up to Seattle multiple times to give priest retreats for the entire archdiocese, something that I think would be unthinkable now for most dioceses. And so Richard Rohr also had a major, major impact on Hunthausen. So I was just, the fact that you mentioned that was, and Gumbleton too, of course, the two were friends. Gumbleton wrote the introduction to Hunthausen's official biography.
Thank you so much for that. Just one thing in the Archdiocese, the Catholic Archdiocese of Los Angeles, we have Archbishop Gomez, who's an Opus Dei bishop, and at all of our protests and all of our marches and all of our actions, there are like 3 Roman Catholic priests that show up. One of them is Chris Ponet, who's a big member of Pax Christi, and then 2 Jesuits from Dolores Mission. No other Catholic priests, and it's really sad. So, that is still here. That kind of craziness. Thank you.
And it's important to hold on to those small little bits of hope, even after, I certainly have a tortuous relationship with the Catholic Church. And so but holding on to that little bit of hope of there are still three. There are still three. Yeah.
There is in the chat from Mike Brennan a note that there is an MP3 available out of Bellarmine University. There's a link you can click on that will take you to a talk by John Stowe, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers and Sisters All, Pope Francis and Thomas Merton on Universal Fraternity. So that's there if you want to pursue that. Mark, what you and Ryan both said there make me think because we've had, I think, in the peace work we've done in the Toronto area here, the the presence of clergy is clergies are basically invisible, and it's left me thinking that peacemaking is more a lay apostolate than it is a clerical or bishop-led sort of thing. But I suppose that's a bit of a I don't know. I shouldn't say that's a bit of a downer. It's I guess it's a negative comment on the hierarchy, but it's a positive comment on the commitment of lay people who are willing to oh gosh, what's his name? His name escapes me, but it's been standing outside of the Pentagon every day, every Monday for the last 28 years, protesting nuclear weapons. But Art laughing. But it's so it speaks to the resilience of the laity and the commitment of lay Christians to doing this ministry. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Seeing no questions, going once, going twice, going three times. Liz, back to you. And Ryan, thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Please join me in lots of gratitude, firstly to Ryan for everything that he shared and enlightened us with this evening. Thank you also to Paul Pinkoski for offering our opening prayer and moderating this evening. And finally, thank you so much to Anne Burkemper for providing technical support for tonight's webinar behind the scenes. We hope you'll join us for Tuesdays with Merton next month, when Father Vincent Pizzuto will speak with us on delicious tranquility, near-death experiences, and the quietude sub rosa. If you would like to learn more about the work of our co-sponsor, the Bernardine Center at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, please visit ctu.edu/academics/Bernardine-Center. If you would like to become a member of the ITMS and receive the Merton Seasonal Magazine, as well as updates on our upcoming programs and conferences, and information on new books published about Thomas Merton, you can join us as a member online at merton.org. Thanks again for joining us this evening and continuing to spread the word about Tuesdays with Merton. We hope you take care, and we look forward to seeing you again in October. Bye.